All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us. We have, I think, 60 people that are joining us from all over the country. So thank you so much for everybody for joining us from all over the place. We have sommeliers, we have some people in media, and we have people that have headphones and speakers, and we have people that are outside, and people from all over the place. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. My name is Jon McDaniel. I own a consulting company in Chicago called Second City Soil. I also sit on the board of the United Sommeliers Foundation, and that's really kind of how this all started to bring the winery together with sommeliers across the country. Melissa and Greg have been generous enough to not only donate their time, but also to help benefit the foundation. So we wanted to find a way to bring sommeliers and wine people from all over the place together to be able to share in these wines and to just share together. You know, typically during these times we would be at festivals. I know Aspen should have been coming up here pretty soon. Pebble Beach just was or was not. So this is a great way to just kind of connect with everybody. The way that this will kind of work, I'll be monitoring the chat aspect of this so you can see whether it be chatting to everybody else. If you have a question, I will do my best to go ahead and ask that question, or basically when you have a question to ask, do it through the chat. And then once we get to kind of a stopping point in Greg's presentation and kind of our back and forth, I'll go ahead and call on you and unmute you to be able to do that. So if anyone has a question, go ahead and type that in the chat, and I'll kind of keep track here. There are 62 people on this, so I'll do my best, and if I happen to miss your question, I do apologize, but Melissa and Greg are certainly available after the fact. So we'll go ahead and get started. We'll go ahead and welcome Melissa Siebert from Ancient Oak, the proprietor, and also Greg La Follette, the winemaker. Greg, happy to have you. Melissa as well. You're both outside. You're both on different aspects of the Ancient Oak. So thanks for the amazing backdrop there. I know that you can, you know, if one of you starts to talk long, to turn around and throw something at the other person, and we'll get this started. But so first, you know, Melissa, why don't you just kind of give a little bit of a background, if you would, on Ancient Oak, how you became to be a proprietor along with your husband.
Sure, absolutely. So the Ancient Oak that we named the winery after is, as Jon said, behind both Greg and me. We're sitting physically distant on either side of the road so that we're not next to each other. It's a big valley oak, several hundred years old, and it sits right in the middle of a vineyard called the Siebert Ranch, which was my husband Ken's grandparents. They came to this land about 70 years ago. And then about 25 years ago, they started to plant vines. So this is a Pinot Noir vineyard. When Ken's grandparents died, Ken's dad had died young. So when Ken's grandparents died, we took over the vineyard. And then we were sitting here one day soon after we had taken it over. And I said to Ken, well, you know, I really love research science. That's what I was doing. I was doing bench research, neuroscience research. I said, you know, I really love science, but you know, we have fairly young kids. I'm wondering what I should do next, if I should find another lab. My lab was closing. And he said, well, I think you should start a winery. And Ken's always been the crazy idea guy of our family. And so I thought that was a crazy idea. But in fact, I did. And started with 196 cases of that one wine, which I proudly trotted out to distributors, and they all kind of patted me on the back and said, "That's sweet, honey. Now go away and come back when you have, you know, when you're a little more real." So we added wines to our portfolio, mostly by finding other vineyards that we could lease and farm, and we'll taste a couple of those today. So that's it. 2006 was our first vintage, and that's really the background of it.
Wonderful, thank you, Melissa. And I know in 2014 it was right that Greg joined the show with you there.
That's right.
Well, Excellent. Well, Greg, welcome to you as well on the other side of the oak there. Greg, I know you've had a very wide experience in the wine world. And if you give a little bit of background about how you went from, I know you were a teen bagpiper in LA to being a winemaker in Sonoma. How did you get to where you are right now?
Well, I'd wanted to be a winemaker since I was maybe 17 years old. And my parents would come up and meet me in Sonoma County, where every year there was the Santa Rosa Highland Games, which was the second largest Highland Games in North America. And I would compete bagpiping and tossing the caber and things like that. But my parents really loved wine, and they had a really great collection. And so I went around to various different tasting rooms with them. And back in those days, in the early 70s, people really didn't care so much about a teenage kid tasting wines with them. And I would ride my bicycle up to meet them here, and I'd actually stop at various wineries. I'd go into the tasting room or the winery, and they'd see my bicycle with all my camping gear, and they'd say, "Well, where are you staying?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm going to be up the road over in both Napa State Park or somewhere like that." And they'd say, "Well, we've got a spare bedroom, or you can have a shower here," or that kind of thing. And very quickly, I learned that wine families grew more than wine; they grew good people. Mm-hmm. And there was one day when I was with a young guy named John Bueller, and he had an infant on his front pack and a toddler walking next to him, and he was popping grapes into his toddler's mouth and looking through a refractometer. And that moment, it struck me that I wanted to be a winemaker. And of course, going back down to LA, where I lived in Southern California, being a winemaker wasn't very practical. It was kind of like going to rabbinical clown school, and no one does it anymore. And so instead, I became a professional bagpiper, and of course, that ended up not being very practical. So after a short stint as a plantsman, my first degree was in plant biology, and then a stint in the seminary of the Catholic Church. 6 kids later, that didn't take. I kind of did the easiest thing. I became a physical chemist and did HIV research at UC San Francisco, and but everybody I worked on died, and I really wasn't cut out for that. So I remembered my early yearnings, and I made a lateral transfer from the staff at at UC San Francisco to UC Davis, and was first on staff there before doing my postgraduate work on how Burgundian winemaking techniques affect mouthfeel. And I haven't looked back ever since. 35 years later, 36 years later, I think that this profession is actually going to take. I couldn't even imagine doing anything other than wine growing at this point. How's that for, is that a good introduction?
That's perfect. That's perfect. A varied story. I'm looking forward to the movie of your life one day, Greg. So we have a lot of people that are thirsty on this. So why don't we start, if you could tell a little bit about your philosophy to Ancient Oak and really coming to the winery, and to be able to do that through, a little bit of general background, and then about the first wine as well, the Nurmi Vineyard Chardonnay too. So to hear a little bit about how you came to Melissa and the team there, and what you're about with the Chardonnay.
Well, I think my philosophy can be summed up by the title on my business card. My title doesn't read Greg La Follette winemaker. It reads Greg La Follette father, husband, winemaker. The first two kind of go hand in hand, but winemaker is number 3. And when I first met Melissa and Ken, it's really touching because, I'm just getting a little choked up thinking about it, but they would come they were working in the same winery that I was working in, that I actually founded, the same exact crew that helped me to start Flowers, To a Man and a Woman,
Mhm.
Also helped me to start Hartford Court and La Crema, most of them. They helped me to start this custom crush facility. So Ken and Melissa were making their wines there, and they would bring in their 2 kids. And having 6 kids of my own, I noted how remarkable it was that the 2 kids were loving and hugging on their parents and vice versa. And it really struck me that because they had such a loving family, that they must be really good people. And so I've used some of their grapes and wine over the years. And in 2014, when their longtime winemaker passed up a job he couldn't refuse up in Oregon, they asked me if I'd like to join with them, and I basically said, hell yes. I didn't know much about them, but I knew they were good people, and I knew that their kids were really good kids. In fact, Lucy is around here somewhere right now. She helped us set up the IT stuff. She just graduated from Mills College, but wine growing is all about people.
Sure.
And it's about not just about farming, but it's about relationships. And that continues into, after the product is bottled, it continues into people who are passionate about what they do. And I think that includes just about everybody who's watching this. Everyone who's here is here taking their time to do this because they love wine. And I'm very grateful that there are people like you out there, because that means that hose draggers like me get to do what I love to do. And I love working with Melissa and Ken. So my philosophy is really simple. It's respect the land, respect your relationships, do wild or native fermentations, as little of fining and filtration as possible. Let the land speak for itself. Be a partner with the land. Our wines are made primarily from the vineyard first. Ken is one of the most intentional and conscientious wine growers I've ever met. And I am really darn lucky to be able to work with the fruit of his hands and translate that into bottle as naturally and with as minimal input as possible.
Very good. And so how
So
your experience, obviously, in Burgundian varietals, a lot of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in your past, how did you approach this particular vineyard in the Nurmi and this wine, from the decades of experience you have in making Chardonnay in Sonoma?
Well, for starters, this is an A-plus site. There, in fact, are not very many sites that are much better than this place. Those of you who may have heard about the Russian River Neighborhoods Initiative, there's 6 neighborhoods. And this particular neighborhood, the Nurmi Vineyard, is at the very north or toe end of what's called Laguna Ridge. It's on a sandy loam called Gold Ridge soil. It's a north-facing slope. It actually looks out over the Kent Ritchie Vineyard, which is a very famous vineyard, neighbor of theirs, down on the flats. But it's up high, and it does not have any direct solar angle of incidence from the sun, so it's quite cool. And it also is very, very well drained. The grapevines are on a pretty steep slope, and so they're almost like bonsai plants in a way. And there have been some other famous people, Costa Brown, David Ramey, using this in the past. But these people have become good friends of ours, and we work alongside them. For instance, harvesting. We do a lot of this. This was harvested by ourselves and our families and a few other people. And then we bring the Chardonnay and the Old Wente Chardonnay in from this exceptional site, just 2.5 miles away to the winery. And we do 100% whole cluster pressing. We go direct to barrel, so we don't do any settling out of the solids at all. And for those of you who don't know about this technique, almost all Chardonnays are settled in a tank, cold settled, before they are then decanted off of the settlings, the juice solids, and then put to barrel. So there can be a lot of problems with that, primarily hot fermentations, stinky fermentations because of the solid levels. And so we don't practice safe winemaking. I like to go to barrel with the full solids complement. There are a few other of us who do this, and we're also called members of the Brown Juice Club. And that is when we press the juice, we actually don't protect it against oxidation. We actually fully oxidize it. We splash it into the tank. We don't gas the barrels at all. We splash it into the barrels. And that's because when you do all that browning, all the phenolics that are in the Chardonnay, they're going to be browning at some point anyway. And so we get our browning and pinking reactions out of the way at the juice stage. That's really important in using minimal amounts of SO2 and increasing the mouthfeel and the texture of the wine. It also means that when you're doing a wild fermentation, you have more oxygen that's available to the wild yeast to create their own survival factors and produce compounds such as sterols that help make their membranes more sturdy against the onslaught of ethanol as it builds up. I've actually written a whole book on this. It's very soporific if anybody wants it, if you have trouble sleeping at night. But it was my thesis work. And so we go to barrel with full solids, and we go to barrel cold, but because there's a higher amount of solids and we're not going to try to reduce the temperature by putting it in a cold room or anything like that, the temperature actually gets pretty hot in the barrels. We get up to 75, 78 degrees, which most California winemakers and small children will run away from screaming at hearing that. But what happens when you build up that temperature is that the yeast, is this getting a little too nerdy, or is this okay?
No, it's good. I think everyone on here just shook. No, keep going. So I think it's
Okay.
a really interesting technique.
So yeah, and so what happens is when it gets up, the temperature gets this high, what happens is the cell membranes, which are normally rigid, and they kept that way to keep the intracellular material, the guts inside the cells, from leaking out, but more importantly, ethanol, which is toxic, from leaking in. So what happens is those cell membranes, when it gets hot and the cells become stressed, those membranes become fluid. Mm-hmm. And so what happens at that point is the yeast become like engineers in an earthquake zone. And any good engineer in an earthquake zone is going to produce steel girders to insert into the walls to keep mm-hmm. walls more rigid. And yeast actually do the same thing, except their steel girders are macromolecules that add to mouthfeel. They even sound mouthfeely. These compounds are called mucopolysaccharides and glycoproteins. And so they produce these to insert them into the cell membranes to stiffen those membranes back up again. And that is one of the keys about making wines that are much more textural, much more mouthfeel driven. Mm-hmm. And we may blow off some fruit in doing that, but you also increase texture and complexity and layers of different mouthfeel components. So all the wines that I make for Ancient Oak, one of the hallmarks about them, they're all different and they all speak entirely to that one vineyard, whatever vineyard I'm making them from. But the common thread is there's lots of mouthfeel to these things. They're texturally driven. And it doesn't come without taking some risks. And high solids is one of them. More and more winemakers are starting to do this, but there's still not very many of us out there who do both high solids and are members of the Brown Juice Club. So some of the more famous people who do this are like Steve Kistler and Helen Turley. They're also members of the Brown Juice Club.
So Greg, how does the different usage of oak that you've experienced over the years do different ages and fill levels, and kind of how does your oak regimen affect your philosophy on utilizing more high solids like that?
That's a great question, and that's something that a lot of young winemakers make mistakes on. For starters, when you have higher solids levels, you can't fill your barrels nearly as full when you start out with the fermentation. So our barrels start out about 2/3 of the way full, because if you fill them up all the way and they get really hot and they bubble over, they foam over. We call it they vomit out of the barrels.
Sure.
So we fill them up only about 2/3 of the way, and then once the fermentation has subsided, we do what's called consolidation. So for every 3 barrels, you end up with 2 full barrels. And frequently our new oak is oak barrels that are new, that are destined for our Pinot programs. But we first barrel ferment Chardonnay in them. And then it's those new barrels that we're actually emptying out of to fill up used barrels. And the new barrels now have the top spin taken out of them so that they can be put into a Pinot Noir program and be a lot more gentle and scalloped and integrated into the wine itself. This is really important. If you're going to use any amount of new oak, you have to be very careful to integrate. And when you also do barrel fermentation, the yeast actually biotransform a lot of the oak compounds. And to give you an example of that, there's a compound that's called a furan. And furans kind of smell sawdusty or planky. We've all smelled it before. And you say, oh, this has got a lot of new oak in it. Well, yeast actually biotransform those furans to their oxidized form called furanaldehydes. So aldehydes are not a bad thing if you're harnessing them in the right way. And what happens is it becomes less planky and sawdusty, and now becomes a lot more integrated and collected into the wine and partnering with the wine better, giving you elements of like sandalwood, or very subtly supporting the fruit notes of the wine. So these wines here, this Nurmi is the 2015 was about 25% new oak, and I don't want the new oak to be the driver. I want the site to be the driver. And so we may have had about 1/3 new oak at the beginning, but a lot of those new barrels are emptied out and then used to fill the other barrels, and we end up with about 25% new oak that sits in barrel on the yeast lees with stirring for about a year. Good result.
No, it's beautiful. And Greg, how does that affect then the long-term ageability when you talk about the texture and the structure of the wine in the beginning, and sacrificing fruit maybe a little bit, but there's so much else going on, and for a 2015 still very vibrant, very youthful. What's kind of the life cycle of a wine like this based off of how you're making it?
Wow. That's really a great question. I want to tell everyone that John and I didn't script this ahead of time. So so what happens when you do the kind of work that we do with higher solids? You have more reductive compounds, which are the opposite of oxidation, obviously. And by doing the oxidation early and dropping these compounds out, the yeast will pull them down. You start out with a wine that is actually a little bit darker and richer to begin with, but the wine will age almost indefinitely. If you were to add SO2, and we don't add SO2 until almost before bottling, certainly after malolactic has completed, and because we do wild malolactic fermentation, we don't even add SO2 sometimes until February or March. The 2019 wines, we didn't finish adding our SO2 until March of this year. But what happens is you don't get those oxidative reactions occurring later on. So you can add both less sulfur dioxide, you can get more richness and texture and less sharpness, because SO2 also is, it's a solvent that grabs onto these compounds and holds onto them. So if you've dropped a lot of those harder or more bitter compounds out earlier, then what happens is you're going to have a wine that ages longer, that has less lower total and free sulfur dioxide, and will keep its overall textural qualities much longer in bottle. Right now, my kids, they're all grown up now, but because child slave labor is legal when you're an agriculturist, all 6 of them had to grow up working with me and things like that. And so now they come home and go into my cellar, and they're starting to pull out wines, including Chardonnays, from the late 90s and early 2000s. And those wines are still living beautifully right now. So these wines will age very well because of what we're doing. It's like a chess game. You have to think ahead of time. You have to think about the oxidative processes that could occur 10 or 20 years from now, deal with them at the moment, deal with them in such a way so that it's kind of like the judo of life. Instead of having this big punch coming at you, this big tannic punch, and hitting you with the jaw, you kind of take it and you grab it and you use it to pull and create a front to back pull through on the palate. We would call this enological hooks. And so when you do this kind of sculpturing of the wine and partnering with the wine, then what happens is you actually are taking a product that could be a bit jangly and harder and maybe fight with the acid. And instead, you're using it to fill out the temporal aspect of the wine. So this is maybe a little counterintuitive, but if you have just the right amount of tannins on the back end, you're actually increasing the length of palate. So instead of making a donut wine where the middle seems kind of hollow and the back end is kind of jangly, what happens is you have this great front to back pull through and you have an extended palate formation because you're doing this. And at the same time, you also are going to have a more long-lived wine. All of my, for those who've had the Flowers wines from the mid to late 90s, I think you'll know what I'm talking about. They're still out there, but they're still living very strongly.
No.
Did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you so much. Thank you. And so that'll be a great transition into your other Burgundian wine that we have here, the Pinot Noir. So from Russian River Valley, we have Alchman 16. So Greg, if you want to tell us a little bit about the sourcing for the wine, for the Pinot grapes, and then how specifically you're making this wine to make it as, I mean, I smell this wine and it smells of Russian River Valley. So how you kind of amplify those flavors and those aromas there.
Well, for starters, the Russian River Valley, it does have 6 unique neighborhoods. And for anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about them, you can go onto the Russian River Valley Wine Growers Association website, and it explains a little bit about the neighborhoods. But our neighborhood where we are now, and you can see that we're looking out over the Russian River Valley from what's called the Eastern Hills. This particular area has a little bit darker color, a little bit stronger tannins. It's the earliest to ripen of all the 6 different neighborhoods, and that's usually a large component of this reserve wine called the Alchman. It can be from any number of the vineyards that we work with in the past. Well, Nurmi is one of them. We've used the McDonald Vineyard, a few other places, friends like that. But so this can come from anywhere. This is not to showplace one particular site. It's to showplace, indeed, the Russian River Valley. So there's a little bit of that earth and cola elements to it. If anyone's interested, I have what are called spider graphs of different regions and how they present themselves. And Melissa, I think you've got a copy of these things, but if you don't, let me know and I can pass this to you or to John to get out there.
Yeah, absolutely. We have several different slides and things that we'll go ahead and send to everybody afterwards, because I know that there'll be some people interested in the details of that. So everyone, we have some different slides and stuff that we'll send you via email after this.
So I find that one of the things that this particular wine represents is what wild fermentation can be like at its best. Wild fermentations give you these kind of feral, visceral, musky kind of elements along with earthiness to them. And the way that works is that a wild fermentation, I think everybody here knows the difference between a wild fermentation and an inoculated fermentation, but if you don't mind, I'll just go over real quickly the difference between the two. Please. Of course, an inoculated fermentation is when you take a packet of yeast, you rip it open, and you dump it into that vat, and that one organism conducts the fermentation, which is great. It's easy. it's predictable. It's practicing safe winemaking. When you do a wild fermentation, you're actually having a whole bunch of different organisms that are conducting the fermentation. So you're not just using Saccharomyces cerevisiae. You're starting out with maybe a very cool climate yeast. In this neck of the woods in the Russian River, that would be a yeast called Clecera, which is an apiculate yeast. Meaning it has two pointy little ends. It's real easy to see under the microscope. There's no mistaking it. It's in our wines. And this one particular yeast only conducts fermentation up to about 2% alcohol, and then it dies out. But it is a cold-loving yeast, and so what it does is when the must is really cold, it actually warms up the juice for the next yeast, which would like it a little bit warmer, and it also produces carbon dioxide gas, so the bad guys, vinegar bacteria, doesn't get in. And as it dies out, it produces a compound that smells of smoked meats or roasted venison, which you can definitely get in this particular wine. That compound is called 4-ethyl guaiacol. And it's different from 4-methyl guaiacol, which is the smell of smoky taint. 4-methyl guaiacol smells more like ashtrays or campfire. There's only one carbon difference in this, but it makes all the difference in the world. So it's smoked meats, roasted venison kind of thing. So this is kind of like a forest fire, clearing out a patch of ground, and then after the fire, you've got this barren patch of ground, and then you have an organismal succession. The very first thing to come in and colonize that area would be some grass seeds. The grass seeds create more tilth to the soil, water holding capacity, organic matter, and then as those grains, the grass seeds ripen, then a bird flies in to eat those grass seeds, and it deposits a bush seed with its own form of fertilizer, and then that bush seed grows up to create even more tilth to the soil, water holding capacity, more importantly shade, so that then an oak, like our ancient oak here, lands and grows up. And then after thousands and thousands of years, you have what's called the prime species, which just a little bit west of here, where I live, are the redwoods. Well, that kind of organismal succession occurs in a vat of naturally fermenting wine in just a few days. So you have Clecera being the first one. It makes it a little warmer for the next one to come along. It protects with some carbon dioxide. It produces its own compound that smells great. And then the next one's ready to take over. And that might be a compound, a yeast called Pichia. And Pichia grows even a little further to maybe 4% alcohol. It produces its own compounds that add to the complexity of the wine, gets ready for the next one. And so by the time you finally have gotten to Saccharomyces, which is the moral equivalent of the redwoods in our biome, you have built up a multiplicity of different flavors and aromas that are not just fruit oriented, but have all these wonderful things like the smell of mushrooms and forest floor. That's a compound called geosmin, which a lot of people consider a spoilage organism or a spoilage aroma. But in small amounts, it has this beautiful champagnol forest floor element that I really like in a wine. So complexity is not an accident, and I want all of my fermentations to be true multiple organism events. I want to invite everybody to the party to come and deposit their own little bit of overall excitement to the milieu. And so what you get is not just something that's totally fruit driven, which is nice to have, but something that is complex and layered. And by the way, you're also getting more textural qualities that are coming along with it too. So that's how we are making this wine. We're partnering with it. And the other thing that we do with these particular wines, as well as first fermenting a lot of the new wood in Chardonnay and then transferring it over to take that top spin off the oak, we're also going to barrel sweet. So we're going to barrel at maybe as much as 3 or 4 bricks. So there's still, 60 grams per liter of sugar left in it. And that finishing of the fermentation does 2 things. The first is that it does more of that biotransformation of the oak volatile phenols. The second thing it does is it allows for all of that yeast to settle down into the bottom. And so now you have more lees contact that really help to enrich and enhance the wine and the mouthfeel and the flavor. So again, most wineries are finishing fermentation dry and then putting it into a separate tank, pressing it off, racking it off of those lees and taking it into barrel. We're not doing any of that. And I think you'll find that some of the best Pinot producers in the world, including in Burgundy, are doing exactly that. But again, it's not practicing safe winemaking. Lots of things that can go wrong.
Absolutely. And that's a great transition to our first question. I'll turn it over to Olivia to ask your question to Greg, if you'd like.
Thank you, Jon, and thank you for hosting this. This is amazing so far. You just spoke of, producers in Burgundy not making safe winemaking, as well as you writing your thesis on the subject. So I was just wondering in particular, who are the specific Burgundy producers whose styles and techniques you like to pull from when creating your Chardonnay and Pinots?
Well, for Chardonnay, I've really appreciated Etienne Sauzet's work. And I love, for instance, his Batard Montrachets are usually this musky, visceral, growly thing. And my wife actually calls that sex in a bottle. And after having raised 6 kids, I'd better make wines that she likes or I'm in trouble. And fortunately, my wife really likes my work. In fact, there was a wine that I made a number of years ago that it got a lot of like Lord God hoo-ha awards, like best Chardonnay in the world for the year, if you believe Wine and Spirits. And, Decanter called it one of the most profound Chardonnays made in America. But it was specifically modeled after Sauzet's Batard Montrachet. And probably one of the better accolades I got from it was this gal named Amy Riley, who writes aphrodisiac cookbooks. And she also still writes the Aphrodisiac of the Month newsletter. Don't raise your hand, people, if you subscribe to it. But in her book, Fork Me, Spoon Me, her cookbook that she wrote, she called that same wine one of the 5 true aphrodisiac wines in the world, the only one from the U.S. And totally and completely, my wife, without even having read it, agreed. She's the one that originally coined that phrase, sex in a bottle, when she tasted that wine. Before then, my wife did not like Chardonnays or even white wines. But since then, I had to attract her originally with my my big Pinots, but it's been the Chardonnays that's kept her coming back now. So Etienne Sauzet specifically for the whites, but also Le Montrachet, DRC. And then, also, if you've ever had our Kent Ritchie Chardonnay, that's made very much in that model. It's actually on the lees for 2 years. And most white wines can't stand 2 years of being on the lees. You have to have a pretty strong vineyard in order to do that. Mm-hmm. For the Pinots, we'll wait until we've got a helicopter going overhead here. For the Pinot Noirs, I really love the work of Domaine Dujac. I also like Albert de Vallon's work with Domaine Romani Conti. In fact, Aubert said he would never make Pinot in the New World. Of course, he has HDV, which he does with the Hyde family. But guess where he started making Pinot in the New World? Was one of the vineyards that we work with that's very close to the Sappho that we're going to be tasting later. That's the Vanderkamp vineyard. Mm-hmm. So Aubert has been a great influence for me, as well as Dujac. I do a fair amount of whole cluster as we can. So I know that's a very long-winded response, but those are probably my main influences from Burgundy.
Yeah, just a few producers that we may have heard of and work with in the wine world. So thank you so much for that. And that'll transition us into moving out of Burgundy into some more kind of classic California. So we'll move on to the Zinfandel next. When I first opened this, just the nose on this just drew me right to Sonoma. So really excited to hear about the 15 vintages of the Pagano Ranch Vineyard Zinfandel, one of the classic Zin vineyards in California. So, Greg, tell us about this wine.
Well, at the winery, which I no longer own, I sold the leasehold improvements to Alla Ridge Wine Services. So someone else owns it now, but the whole crew there call this the bad boy of the vintage, and it's always one of the very last, if not the last, grapes to come into the winery. It's picked. Picking it is pretty easy to do. You basically pick it before it rots all to hell. So
Just that.
yeah, and oftentimes we have to pick it in maybe 2 different levels. The first one before rain is going to be coming, and we know that those particular grapes are going to be vulnerable. And then afterwards we assess, we drop rot, and then we allow the next batch to go a little bit longer. It's extremely high natural acidity. And this is a wine that, for instance, the 2019 vintage is still going through malolactic fermentation. We actually have it sitting outside in the sun. We pull it out every day to give the barrels warmth to have it finish up. And that's just part of, doing native fermentation. Sometimes you have to do that kind of thing. But the acidity on this is usually over 10 grams per liter starting out. And as a point of reference, that's roughly equivalent to sparkling wine acid levels. So it's very difficult to finish both primary and secondary fermentation. This is done, unlike the Alkmaar. The Alkmaar is done in very small open top fermenters that are hand plunged. In fact, they're about 7 feet around and about 3.5 feet tall, and we actually do the cap manipulation by hand. They look pretty similar to the concrete fermenters that you would find in Burgundy, which are shallow and kind of broad with great surface to volume ratio. This particular wine is not done that way. It's done in 5-ton fermenters, which are kind of big fermentations, and we do use glycol cooled jackets. Also, unlike our Pinots where the temperature gets insanely high, this one we tend to keep the fruit, the fermentation, at about 75 degrees. Compare that to our Pinots that get up to about 95 degrees. In fact, the cap temperature on our Pinots can get up to close to 100 degrees. But this one, we keep it cool, nice steady fermentation. We do want to build the fruit on this. Pinot Noir, you love it when it's kind of naughty and visceral and growly. But Zinfandel should be a fruit riot in your mouth. And so we are looking to build the fruit more in this, and we're doing it a bit more conventionally in that sense. And in fact, this particular wine was inoculated with a William Sellium strain of yeast that was grown in a laboratory, and that's primarily because if we tried doing a wild fermentation with this, it would never get through. And it's pretty simple. This one, we do ferment it almost to dryness. We don't use very much new oak at all. And we do go to barrel a little bit dirty, but then we will rack it after about 3 months. So it does not stay on the lees itself. We're really focusing on the fruit forward aspects and the playfulness of this wine, because that's what this vineyard can do. It's in it's called the Wood Road District, Old Vine District. And I've worked with the Old Vines, Peter Finuca's vineyard. I helped to actually resuscitate the Hartford vineyard. When I went in there, it was all overgrown, and I did all the original amplography on it. Next door to that is the Chelly High Wired vineyard. I worked with that vineyard too. And this one is just on the other side of the paddock from Peter Finuca's vineyard. Done very traditionally, head trained, spur pruned, really old school.
Very good, excellent.
No trellising. Yeah.
Wonderful. Greg, we have a question from Domenico there in suburbs of Chicago. Domenico, you want to ask your question about the Zin?
Yes, love Zins, and there's so many different styles, as we all know. The jammy styles, the Lodi styles, the Sonoma, the Paso Robles. This very, very unique. I mean, it's like, what is the elevation of this? And, when you pick where it's actually growing and the specifics, you said the inoculation that was done in lab, what do you do to get that, achieve that, like that peachy yogurt aromas that are coming out of there in the flavors on the finish? Because I know, like with Zins, you pick some grapes are going to be more green. Some are going to be more ripe than others. So more on that, I guess.
Yeah, that's really a great question. And first off, the elevation I think is about 80, 90 feet in elevation. It's on the Santa Rosa floodplains, so it's not a very exceptional site, except that it has fairly heavy clay loam. In fact, there's some areas that don't really dry out. There's actually kind of a creek running through the middle of it, so there is some rocky elements to it, but it's fairly heavy clay in there. And the peach yogurt aspect is coming from two different things. The first is that the malolactic fermentation really goes very long. So like I said, the 2019, it's May, and it's still going through secondary fermentation. So when you have that happening, when the primary and secondary fermentation are coupled more closely together, the yeast will actually consume the diacetyl, which is the buttery kind of compound, or the yogurty kind of compound. It's the lactic element, and so yeast will consume that to actually integrate your fruit more, integrate the flavors more. But in this case, it took a lot longer for it to finish through. The second thing that's going on in here is because you also had a late, long, struggling primary fermentation, the yeast were really under a lot of stress, and they were really struggling to consume everything that they could before they finished primary fermentations. And this is maybe a little bit too short of a time to explain, but one of the results is kind of a floral or fruity aspect. It's called 4-ethylphenethanol, which is the smell of rose petals or violets, and actually can add to that perfumed sense as well. Is that a relatively good explanation for you?
I think we're all in agreement there. Jason, I'll turn it over to you now for your question on production of Zinfandel.
Yeah, hi, Greg. Love your wines, as always. Good to see you. So, I've always known you as like a Pinot Noir Chardonnay guy, really like at heart, but like, so is Zinfandel, like, is this, what have been the challenges, or like, what is different about maybe production of making Zinfandel versus like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in terms of winemaking and things to consider in terms of, I guess science and just, philosophy?
Well, I do approach Zinfandel fundamentally differently than I do Chardonnay or Pinot, or than Bordeaux varietals. And with Zinfandel, I really want to focus on the fruit forward aspect. Zinfandel can be such a playful wine, and so that's really what I want to celebrate is its fruit forward aspect to it. So it's a cooler fermentation. In this case, it's inoculated. It's a bigger fermentation vessel overall. Also, it tends to stay en cuvée sans a lot longer. So for instance, with this one, there's less, we do like up to 10 days of cold soak on our Pinot Noirs. On this one, because we're inoculating, basically the fermentation is started in 3 or 4 days. So there's really no cold soak. But because we're fermenting slower, you can have this be in tank. For instance, in 2018, we pressed off the day before Thanksgiving. So it can be en cuvée sans or in tank for maybe even up to a month. Whereas Pinot is relatively short. After that cold soak time, the fermentation is very short and savage. And so you're only looking at maybe 15 days for Pinot, twice as long for this.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Dave, we'll turn it over to you for your question from DC.
Yeah, hi, Greg. I have a question.
Yep.
Good to see you. Thanks. This is very interesting, and the wines are delicious. But John just noted that Bill Pagnano and his dad planted this from heritage bud wood from an older vineyard. Do we know how much of that vineyard was actually Zinfandel? Because I know that when people go in and actually test, now that we have that technology, they're finding that what was labeled Zinfandel all these years is kind of a variety of varieties, if that makes sense.
That makes great sense. In fact, that is a really relevant question because most of the old vine Zinfandel, as you pointed out, are not all Zinfandel. This is probably, I would guess, around 95% Zinfandel. We don't really know, but there are other varietals in there too. And we know there's Petit Syrah, not much of it. It really has a hard time ripening, by the way. And there's also some Chardonnay in there as well. But the Chardonnay is a real target for birds, so not a whole lot of that makes it into the ferment. But we chuck it all in. Whatever is in there, we put it all in. And I would say it's probably, by the time it all gets into the tank, it's probably about 95% Zinfandel.
Thank you.
And, that's really important because there are very few Zinfandel vineyards that are 100% Zin from the old days.
Amazing. Thank you, Dave. Greg, as I'm tasting this wine and noticing, Zinfandel is one of those varietals, as Domenico touched on, the vast range of Zins that we see from across California. The one thing I noticed about this, it's listed as over 15% alcohol, but the balance of alcohol and acidity is really, really balanced there. Can you kind of talk about that kind of philosophy on where you look at for alcohol is in and how you've got to this point?
Another good question, and I don't really have a great answer other than the fact that we really don't use a refractometer for any of our picking decisions. We're picking entirely based on phenological ripeness, and I haven't used a refractometer in almost 30 years for any picking decision. I'm looking for ripeness, and so in that sense, alcohol doesn't really fit into the equation very much for me. If it's ripe, if it's what the vineyard wants it to be, then that's what it is. And Zinfandel, by its very nature, because you have on one cluster, you can have green berries or pink berries, and you can have shriveled raisins all on one cluster. And that's because Zinfandel, particularly these heritage clones, are not very good pollinators. So pollination can occur over a 2-week period. And what that means that you're going to get these huge variations in ripeness. And it also means that you don't even know where the alcohol is going to end up, because when you're doing cold soak, like on Pinot, typically what you want to do is you're going to watch that the bricks go up and up and up a little bit. So you pick at like 23 bricks. By the time the fermentation is ready to start, it could be up to like 24, 24 and a half even. But with Zinfandel, we're picking this somewhere between 22 and a half bricks and 24 bricks. But with all the raisin fruit in there, who knows where it's going? And so it ends up being over 15% alcohol usually, although there's been a couple of years where it's been actually even under 14. But that's what the vineyard gives us. So we're not really trying to manipulate that one way or the other. We're just, it's what Bacchus gives us.
No, it's incredibly balanced. And I think when we talk about alcohol, I think this has everything in check with each other. So it's amazing. Ellen, I'm going to turn it over to you for your question. I think you had a great one as well.
Okay. Hey, Greg. Hey, Melissa. Good to see you guys. I'm enjoying your 14 Kent Ritchie tonight, which is great. I have kind of a more, a less geeky question, but I was wondering, you mentioned a few times that you, that you're practicing unsafe winemaking, and I was just wondering if you had an experience that it got a little too wild for you, and what happens? What do you do?
That happens sometimes, but when you get to know your vineyards pretty well, when you have a master craftsman such as Ken doing the farming, it's kind of like getting to know a friend. And once you get to know a friend pretty well, you're pretty secure. You both might have an argument, but in the end, you know that you're both going to come out of it okay because you love each other. So that's pretty much how I feel about my wines. This year, 2019, we did have some problems with our wines, in part because we had the Kincaid fire. And so the winery was actually closed. It was evacuated for 8 days. There was no power, no water. And during that period of time, I would have probably put in 100 man hours working with the wines and very gently babying them. And so when you're doing these wild fermentations, you do have a lot of tools available to you. You can do cross inoculations. You can put barrels out in the sun. You can add some colder juice to it from another barrel. You can stir more. But if you don't have, it's kind of like when you have kids, when it's a lot better for you to be there when your kids are really young. In fact, you have to be. When they're really little, you have to diaper them and be there all the time for them. When they get a little older, you can put them in the sandbox to play with the other kids while you sit on the bench with the other parents. And then by the time they get to be teenagers, you hand them the car keys and just hope that you don't get a call at 2 a.m. To go to the Hoosgow and bail them out. And wines are very much like that as well. And unfortunately, this year, the kids were kind of juveniles, and some of them kind of went off the rails a little bit. And wines are like kids too, in that it's a lot better to be there and give them a little pat on the butt here or there to make sure they kind of are staying on the right path, rather than you're not there at all. They completely come off the rails, and then you've got to spend a lot more effort and energy getting them back on the right path again. Kids and wine are both a lot like that. And this year in 2019, we simply couldn't be there as much as we wanted to. We had some problems with stinky lees. We've actually racked more wines off the lees than I would really like to do. We've had to do a few more interventions than I would have liked to have done. But they're all going to be there. They're all going to be really great wines. And in fact, some of them might be some of the best wines we've yet made. The 2019 Nurmi is absolutely stunningly spectacular, Nurmi Pinot. So we do, those things happen. If you're a good parent, you're there for your kids, and fewer bad things happen. I never wanted to hire a nanny. I always wanted to diaper my own kids, and I do the same thing with my wines. I'm there for them 24/7.
Win Dad of the Year as well. So that we'll transition to then our fourth wine, which is the Sappho, the kind of Bordeaux style blend from Burger Vineyard. So we moved from Russian River and kind of more valley floor to Sonoma Mountain here with the 2014. So Greg, if you could tell us a little bit about the Burger Vineyard and how this wine comes together in this Merlot dominant blend here.
Well, the Burger Ranch is one of the most historic vineyards on Sonoma Mountain. It's one of the oldest vineyards on Sonoma Mountain. In fact, I think that the Merlot here is the oldest Merlot on Sonoma Mountain. It was actually planted in the late 1800s by the Burger family. And in fact, there's old pictures of them harvesting around the turn of the century and there's a wagon that's stuck between what's now Laurel Glen Vineyard and what's now the Burger Ranch. Mm-hmm. And back in those days, the Laurel Glen Vineyard was actually part of the Burger Ranch, planted with vines. Well, so Prohibition came, and the vines went into disrepair. And at some point after that, Fred Burger decided he was going to replant. And he actually replanted before Patrick Campbell did at Laurel Glen, and before they sold to what now is made Laurel Glen. So this is a very old historic vineyard. And in fact, when you go there, a lot of the vines, it's done on terracing, and there's not much that's done on terracing anymore. But a lot of the vines are just leaning at kind of a crazy angle, these old vines. So the farming is a little bit dicey there, the tractor work, but Ken is very good at that too. He does all his own tractor work as well. And it just makes this iconic old school Bordeaux blend. This is mostly Merlot. There's some Cabernet Franc and some Cabernet Sauvignon in it. The interesting thing is that the Cabernet there is massive. It's one of the biggest Merlots I've ever seen. And in fact, we use the Cabernet Sauvignon to kind of tame down the Merlot rather than the other way around. It's pretty crazy. But this is one of the reasons also, in addition to Ken and Melissa's kids, why I wanted to work with this particular brand and the people, was because the Burger Ranch is really a fabulous vineyard. And by the way, I love Bordeaux blends that actually smell like Bordeaux blends. To have a little bit of that black and green olive in there and that kind of thing. To me, there's too many people who are trying to de-Bordeauxize Bordeaux blends and using a tremendous amount of new oak and stuff like that. We just don't want to go there.
Interesting. All right, let me meet Michael here. Michael, I'm going to go ahead and go to your question. You have a great question on Merlot. Obviously, an interesting varietal that we continue to talk about here. So as soon as I can unmute you. There we go. Michael, go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, Greg, love your wines. And Melissa, thank you for inviting me to this. This is great. Merlot is a varietal that I have a lot of respect for, and obviously we know in the broader wine world isn't universally loved. And those of us who have been around a little longer and are paying attention know that there's been a lot of really bad dry site Merlot from California over the years. Yep. Know that Merlot loves wet feet, traditionally in Bordeaux, but this is very expressive of Merlot, and obviously Burger Vineyard is not a place where the vines are going to have a lot of wet feet, or maybe it is, I don't know, but it doesn't seem like it is. So I'm kind of curious to discuss, how is this so very expressive of Merlot without seeming to be in a site that Merlot would favor?
That's a great question. And for starters, the site is relatively high altitude, mm-hmm. which I think is giving it some of its like the high mountain tannin aspect to it. It is an east-facing slope, so it's almost perfect in a way, because what happens is the sun hits, so it's east-facing, the sun hits in the morning and warms up the soil relatively quickly, and then by afternoon the sun is here, and so there's no direct angle of incidence on the sun in the afternoon when it's hottest. And I think that's a big part of this particular vineyard. Also, the fact that they're old vines, you can't really you can't replace old vines. It's just it's a Sonoma County cultural treasure. The other aspect is it's volcanic soil, and it's kind of the same kind of soil you think about when you think about the rocky volcanic soil. So it is not very clay-like. It's pretty well drained, and it's mostly dry farmed. There are some sections that do have to be watered because it is so very well drained, but there's some years like 2015, it was 2014, okay. But in 2015, we hardly had to do any irrigation at all on it. And I think that tends to make a difference. Also, in colder vintages where other people are complaining about, the capsicum or, the vegetal qualities, we actually get just the right amount. And I think that, again, that has to do with the angle of the sun. And also the fact that it's a California tea trellis, which is very old school. So it's got that spread out thing, and it kind of does a little ballerina thing. And that tends to give us really nicely dappled sunlight. And so this is one of those cases where it's not vertically shoot positioned, where you have 2.5 leaf layer number, that kind of thing. It's just kind of dappled all the way around. And there's also an afternoon, the winds come up there in the afternoon, and that tends to play the light a lot more even on those vines. It's just a magic place. And I can't really put my finger on all of it, but those are the main things I would say that really helps make it that way. And then the winemaking is really, really straight ahead winemaking. It's all wild fermentation, but it is also in 5-ton fermenters, and it's also done with cooler temperatures and glycol cooling jackets. Even though it's not inoculated, it still has also a very long cuvaison, almost a month for this. It takes a long time for it to take off, so it does get, I guess, what you'd call cold soak. So we know exactly what the temperature, the sugar's going to go up to. So this one's 14.2 alcohol, and that's actually pretty high for this. There's some vintages where our alcohols are as low as 12.6. But every year it's its own expression, and it's because of this old vineyard that is just its own unique self, and it's farmed impeccably by Ken.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. So Deborah, I'm trying to unmute you, but in case that doesn't work out here, I knew your question. Greg, Deborah was wondering about the Massal selection of Laurel Glen Cabernet, and if that had any sourcing there. And looks like Deborah, we finally got you off of that. So my apologies.
Yeah, I'm off now.
Question specifically there. There you go.
Hey, Deborah.
Hey, Greg. Hi. Thanks very much. What a treat. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Yeah. So your question's about the Massal selection of the Laurel Glen?
Yeah, it makes sense that if Berger was part of that original vineyard, that there might be some of that same clonal material in there. Now, I was just talking to Randall Watkins, so now I'm curious.
Well, Melissa, do you know what the selection is at Laurel Glen? Did they take from Berger Ranch?
It seems like it would have been the other way around, I think, right?
Well, Berger was planted first, so it would have gone Berger to Laurel Glen. But I don't know that for a fact. Patrick Campbell, he's living in Lodi now.
Yeah.
And so I haven't had a chance to see him out there. But I think that'd be a good question to ask him. He'd probably know.
Yeah, you're right. That's a question for the future.
Yes, quite
to
so.
get clarity on that. Because, the Laurel Glen is a specific clone now. It's a Davis FPS clone. So.
I didn't know that. So it might be
Plant Foundation Services clone, yeah.
Wow, that is very cool. I didn't know that.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
I can't say I think they taste the same, but it's hard to know. They're farmed differently. So, but thank you.
Oh, thank you. You learn something every day. I just learned something. So,
Angelo, we'll come to you next for your question.
Yes, I just want to ask, how old are these vines and what will be your production in it?
The vines are anywhere from the late 60s to, I think the newest blocks were planted in the mid 70s, I think, including one of the upper Merlot blocks is one of the newer ones. And was that planted like 75, 76, something like that. So the newest ones, I think that old vines are anything that are older than me. But these are pretty old for Cabernet in Sonoma County. And the production is really tiny. It's anywhere from some years, it's a quarter of an acre a ton. Other years, we get as much as maybe even up to 1.5 tons to the acre, but it's very low yielding.
Okay, awesome. That sounds great. It's delicious. Thank you.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Angelo. Keith, we'll come to you next. You had a really good question on some of the things that I see Greg is continually referencing on texture.
Awesome. Yeah. So, a spectacular way to spend an afternoon. Thank you very much. This is really, really good. Question here. So my question is this kind of like asking Michelangelo for a recommendation on a paint by number set, but mouthfeel and texture. So like for those of us who sell wines, talk about wines, trying to convey to people how wines taste, it's pretty easy, I feel, to pick up the skills of aromas and flavors. But describing and conveying texture and mouthfeel, especially as I feel like it's something more than a sensation. It's like an interplay of structural factors. And to me, it's like when I hear winemakers speak about it, it's really things coming together to like form a completeness. And I would love to know any resources, books, techniques, approaches that you'd recommend for someone to kind of develop their vocabulary and better to describe texture.
Wow. Well, it's still an evolving field. In fact, when I elucidated mouthfeel in wine, it had not been done before. I was the first person to do it. It had been done in beer and milk, but not in wine. So that tells you basically how new the field is. Since my thesis work, there have been a number of like there was an international mouthfeel symposium, and I'm not sure how to get a hold of the yeah, it sounds kind of dirty in a way, but I don't know how to get a hold of the symposium proceedings, but I spoke at it and Noble did. AWRI has also done a lot of work on mouthfeel, as have the Kiwis. But there's still not a lot known about what mouthfeel actually is. And one of the things we tried to do was measuring things like viscosity. But as it turns out, our own palates are much more sensitive than like an Oswald viscometer or something to measure it with. So we're still at this stage where it's just up to our own mouths to do these things. I tried to develop what was called a complexity scale. That didn't work out. And boy, it's a tough nut to crack, and it still hasn't really been cracked yet. So it's a great question. I'd say look at the AWRI, Australian Wine Research Institute. I think they've got some of the latest lexicons on mouthfeel and texture.
Wonderful.
Good show.
Thank you so much. Jordan, we'll transition over to you for your question.
This is a question for both Greg and Melissa. As far as the 4 wines we're tasting today, is there one of them that you would say is the most representative of what you're trying to do at Ancient Oak? Which of the wines would you see as kind of the best part of the project, or the part of the project that you see as communicating your ideas or your philosophies the most thoroughly?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one for you, Melissa.
Well, that's hard. That's like asking me my favorite child, right? And of course it's Lucy, but she's just because she's here. I don't know, Jordan. That's a really good question. I sometimes have people ask, well, I thought Greg made Chardonnay Pinot. What's he doing making Zinfandel and Cabernet and Merlot and Cab Franc? And I think the reason we do that is because it really showcases the diversity of Sonoma County. And that's something we want to do. We're making wines from where we live, but we have a lot of amazing varietals within where we live. If someone really presses me on my favorite wine, I will have to say probably the Siebert Ranch Pinot, because it's from where I live and grow those grapes. I mean, it's where I live. It's our heart. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in the 2017 wildfires. Our house, barns, everything, not wine in barrel or wine in bottle. So fortunately, we didn't have that destroyed. But the vineyard itself was actually wiped out. We have replanted that vineyard now as we sit in it. So I guess I would have to say the Siebert Ranch Pinot. The Auckland Pinot is also one of my my personal very favorites, and I think it really just speaks to the distinctiveness of Greg's style. As Greg said, the Alkman is really not about place. Alkman is not the name of a vineyard. It's just a fanciful name that we gave it. As is Sappho. Alkman and Sappho, gets geeky in a different way, but Alkman and Sappho were both 6th century BCE Greek lyric poets. My husband Ken and I met in college, and he studied classics. So we made this Alkman Pinot because there was a small ferment that we made for the first time in, Greg, was it 15? I think it was.
Oh, it was 14.
14. First time in 14. Okay.
Yeah.
We made the Alkman Pinot. It was a small ferment that just, Greg, I don't know, Greg could talk about what he did with it, but it came when Ken and Greg and I were doing our blending trials. We just felt we couldn't couldn't blend it away. It was made to be potentially a component to a blend. We felt that we just couldn't blend it away, and instead we made the Alpin Pinot. So I'd have to, I guess, say the Secret Rancher Alpin Pinot, Jordan.
Awesome. Thank you.
If I could add to that maybe a little bit, the 2014 Alkman originally came about because, well, we had some extra grapes, and I had these really small fermenters that I was talking about that I'd been using for years for all of my stuff in the past, and they actually were cattle troughs. They were, I got them for free from a farmer in Petaluma, and yeah, I had to patch them up and that kind of thing, but they have great surface to volume ratio, and I had a little bit of extra grapes left over that year, and so I kind of just put them into this thing. And when Melissa and Ken came over, they're looking at this and going like, wait a minute, that's some of our best grapes. What's it doing? And these things are called CPRs. They're called crappy plastic rounds, and that's what the crew calls them euphemistically. But it ended up actually making some of our very best wine, and we've been making the Alkman wines in those fermenters ever since then. And to answer your question about my favorite wine, it is whatever my wife likes best.
The ultimate diplomat. I love it, Greg. George, we'll come to you next for your question on Zinfandel.
Nice. Thank you so much. Thanks, John. Thanks, Greg. I love your juice. It's mad dope. Really dope. But yeah, it relates to the Zinfandel, and in particular in 2017 when there was like this kind of heat wave that happened. And what you do usually when the grapes almost kind of like shut down, or what do they do? From what I know is that they kind of shut down. And what do you usually do when that happens?
Well, you're exactly right, George. The vines do shut down when it gets too hot. And in 2017, we had some unprecedented heat. And in fact, in the Pagnano vineyard, I think it got up to about 112 degrees, which it really hadn't before. This is the 2015, but in 2017, when something like that happens, you have to trust that you have a deep enough root system and that the vines will recover. What you have to do first is you prophylactically water them. So you know that the heat is coming, and you just put as much water onto them as you possibly can. And in 2017, actually, there were some vineyards that used overhead sprinklers to help to lower the overall latent heat of the vineyards. In fact, Gallo's very best vineyard, their Laguna vineyard, which is not too far away from us, they actually were doing that sprinkler heating. In our case there, we did do prophylactic watering of the Zinfandel, and it popped back just fine afterwards. And that's because Zinfandel, when it's been planted for a number of years on St. George rootstock, it tends to be pretty deep-rooted and overcomes that. There's other rootstocks that are what are called Riparia rootstock based. Riparia is exactly what it sounds like. It's riparian. So 5C is one of those, or SO4. SO4 is a rootstock that's mostly used in Germany. Another one would be 10114 rootstock, which is used a lot in Burgundy. And these guys generally don't tend to see these heat waves, but those particular rootstocks are particularly susceptible to heat waves. And 5C in particular, when it gets hit by a heat wave, it just kind of shuts down and doesn't really come back. That wasn't the case with our Pagnano Zinfandel vineyard, which is planted to St. George, which is a very old rootstock from the late 1800s that is a rootstock called a rupestris Dulat. I know that's kind of fairly typical, but that's probably the best answer that I can give you.
Wow, thank you so much. Again, this has been mad dope, and your juice is amazing.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful. One last question here, and it comes from Eric, actually. Which vintage of the aluminum, what am I doing here? I'm reading this. Eric, I'll talk to you on that one. Any final questions from anybody as we kind of wrap this up, I know we have a lot of information and a lot of great quotes that we're going to be using for years to come after this. So once we wrap this up, we'll go ahead and send out the link to this video so that you can share it with your teams and peers and those that weren't able to be on this, as well as there's some slides and some other information, some more details and graphs and things like that for this. So wanted to thank everybody. To get 60 sommeliers all together at one time is beyond amazing. So Melissa, thank you so much to you for being willing to support the sommelier community and the United Sommeliers Foundation to be able to send wine to everybody, which is incredible. So thank you so much for that. And to everybody for coming and for tasting with us here. I think we've all experienced these wines, 4 very beautiful wines. Hopefully that for some of you that may not have known the wines before, that you are able to find them in your local markets, and Melissa can connect you, with the local teams based off of where you are. So thank you to everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy. Melissa, Greg, thank you so much to both of you for taking the time and for the beautiful backdrop there. And hopefully we have a great summer that one way or another that we can see you in person, and that we can all get together here sometime in the near future.
Well, if I can just add, I'd like to say thank you to all of you. I see a lot of young faces out there, and I suspect that you guys really are the future of our industry. And I just want to say thank you for your passion, your skill, for dedicating your lives to the furthering of wine knowledge. And thank you for allowing me to have one of the best jobs I could possibly have, because you guys are out there getting the juice out. So from all of my family and from all of us, thank you.
Very good. Wonderful. Thank you all so very much. Have a great weekend, holiday or not, or I think it's Friday, right? So have a good Friday, everybody. Take care, everyone. Stay healthy, and we'll all get together soon, hopefully.
Yay. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.